Okay, welcome back, everyone. So last time we began talking about the person situation debate, beginning to think about which factors might influence criminal behavior. And this first module is really going to be looking at those risk factors and psychological theories and explanations. Today's lecture focusing on the situational risk factors, okay? So I'm going to take a bit of an unusual approach for today's lecture because I'm going to center everything I talk about around one case as an example. Now, during the course, I might give some cases to illustrate what I'm talking about as we talk about serial killers, fire setters, and so on. I might give you some cases, but I'll never, again, center everything around one particular case. The case I'm choosing is the subject of the book Ordinary Men by historian Christoper Browning, in which he outlines what happened during the Holocaust, focusing on particular perpetrators of the Holocaust, trying to understand what made normal people, ordinary men, become instruments of genocide. And he uses social psychology and the situational risk factors that there were in order to explain what happened, focusing mainly on the conformity, peer pressure, obedience to authority, de-individuation, which is losing one's self-identity, taking on the identity of a group. Now, it's a case that really perfectly illustrates the main theories and research I want to talk about, the influence of these concepts. But also, when we're talking about situational risk factors, it's a bit more unusual than the other risk factors I'm going to talk about. Because when I talk about risk factors, I'm usually talking about predispositions, a personality characteristic or a brain dysfunction or something in the individual's background that predispose them to being more likely to commit crime. When we talk about situational risk factors, we're talking about the situational factors themselves, okay, influencing the person to commit crime. So we have to look at a case in which the individuals were not committing crimes beforehand, okay, and these individuals, were not committing acts of violence against Jews, for example, until they were conscripted into this particular role, okay? So it wasn't until they were in this particular situation, in this group setting, okay, that they then began committing war crimes and so on. So, like I say, Christoper Browning's book uses group processes, social psychology, to really explain what influenced these individuals. The four main pieces of evidence I'm going to come back to talk about in more detail, but they are Solomon Ash's conformity, peer pressure studies, Stanley Milgram's obedience to authority experiments, Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, and then the evidence of cognitive dissonance. So when I say police battalion, which is what Ordinary Men is about, it's about a particular group of perpetrators called Reserve Police Battalion 101. These were men who were brought in to help with the war efforts, but they were too old to fight on the front lines. And so they were given some other duty, okay? And quite often what these duties were aiding in some way with the final solution, okay? And that's what I mean when I'm talking about a reserve police battalion. Now, there was over 500 men in this battalion, okay, who committed these acts together. Decades after the war, their commanding officers were on trial, okay, and over 200 of these men were traced down by investigators, and they gave testimony to help in the criminal proceedings against the commanding officers. And then later on, Christoper Browning, as a historian, was looking over the transcripts, okay, because the interviews between police and these 200 men were transcribed for the investigations and the courtroom legal proceedings. And when he went over these transcripts, they were really, really important for historians in understanding what happened in the Holocaust for a number of reasons. First of all, they gave us finally some insights into those at the bottom of the genocidal pyramid, if you like, those who were the ones obeying the orders, actually carrying out the commands to kill. We knew quite a lot about those at the top, the ideologues who were giving the orders, right? Hitler and Himmler, okay? And even about quite a lot about the middlemen, Rudolf Höss, who was the commander of Auschwitz, and Adolf Eichmann, who was in charge of making sure the trains ran on time to the concentration camps. And we had a pretty good understanding that these were not psychologically typical individuals, okay? There was good evidence of personality disorders, okay, pretty severe mental pathologies, okay? They made these people pretty atypical, right? Rudolf Höss was the commander of Auschwitz, and he oversaw 1.1 million people be killed, and he traveled around Europe visiting death camps to make sure that his would be the most efficient. And before he was, and it was the most efficient, it was a camp capable of executing 70,000 people in a single day. And before he was executed, he wrote about his life. And out of all the things I've read, this was probably the most disturbing text I've ever read. And I've had a background in forensic psychology, specializing in crimes against children. So I've came across some disturbing content. But what was most disturbing about this text is that it wasn't really the details he was going into, but how normal he thought he was, okay, and how he thought he wasn't to blame for anything that had happened. And so the evidence is quite clear that there's some abnormalities with these individuals. But what about those at the bottom, okay? Those many Germans who were obeying orders, okay, carrying out the actual killings, okay, taking people to the concentration camps and so on. We can't argue that they were all, mentally abnormal in some way. And finally, we were getting some insight through these transcripts into the psychology of these individuals, right? These individuals weren't writing everything down like those at the top. They weren't making speeches. Okay, if they were writing home to their loved ones weren't sharing the letters with historians. They were burning the evidence and so on. So until these transcripts came to light, we really had no idea really about the mental states and so on of those who were actually carrying out the killing. It was also important because it dealt with the issue of choice directly. The defense of the Nuremberg trials, which is when the Nazis were put on trial for their war crimes, the defense again and again was, well, I followed orders because I would have been executed if I didn't, okay? And despite this being the most common defense, there was never any evidence put forward, okay, to support this claim. In fact, to counter this, there's letters from Himmler to his generals saying that, yes, some individuals, some men are not capable of killing civilians. These men should be assigned different roles, okay? But once the defendants of the Nuremberg trials were confronted with this, they would say, well, I didn't know that, okay? I just thought in the moment that if I didn't obey this order, I would have been executed, even though there was no cases of someone refusing to kill civilians and then being executed for it. But finally, when looking at these transcripts, we had direct evidence against this defense, okay? Because the members of Police Battalion 101 were given the choice, okay? They were told, okay, you can sit out on this, okay? We're going to be killing these civilians in a mass shooting, okay, or in a firing squad, okay? You can volunteer to take part, or you can sit it out. Out of the 500 plus men in the first killing, 8 of them chose to opt out, okay? Nothing happened to these 8 men. They remained part of the battalion, okay? They went on the next day to continue being part of the battalion and so on. There was no consequences for sitting out, okay? The other men saw this, okay? So they knew that opting out was an option, okay, going forward. And in some cases going forward, some men did choose to opt out, okay? So from this evidence, we knew that there was the option of choice. But also this testimony was far more vivid, detailed, and probably truthful than any of the testimony we had came across before. Testimony by such individuals usually were self-serving, okay, because they were trying to, lessen the sentence that they might be given if found guilty for war crimes. But these men, members of Police Battalion 101, had all been given immunity, okay, because it was the commanding officers that the investigators were trying to prosecute. So they could be as forthcoming as they liked with the details and with their own responsibilities, and they knew that they would face no consequences, okay, for their honesty. Also, a number of them quite disliked their commanding officers, and so they had no real reason to not be forthcoming or to try and protect the people who were being prosecuted. Furthermore, like I say, about 200 of these men are being interviewed, and overwhelmingly their testimonies are in agreement, okay, over what had happened, the events that took place, the commands they had been given, and so on. And so again, that gives us pretty good confidence that this is pretty truthful testimony. So who were they? These members of Police Battalion 101, 500 reserve policemen, like I say, members pulled into the war effort who are too old to fight on the front lines, so helping with the final solution. 210 of them later giving testimony in these legal proceedings, these interviews being transcribed. They operated in Poland from the summer of 1942 until the Russians chased them out in 1944, pretty close to Treblinka, which was one of the death camps. The average age of this group was 39 years old. Now, this is important because it tells us these men were too young to have fought in World War I. So these are not men who were brutalized by war and by violence and by the trenches, okay? These were not men who were desensitized to violence, okay? But also, these were men who were too old to have been brought up in the Hitler Youth Program and in the Nazi bubble, if you like, okay? They were old enough to remember what democracy was like. They were old enough to remember what it was like to be able to choose the political party you wanted to vote for. They remembered what it was like, you know, to have Jewish friends and Jewish neighbors, okay? They remembered what it was like before there was this, you know, Nazi bubble where people were Nazified. They had a yardstick, right, that they could compare what life is like now to what life was like before. So these are not people who were, you know, completely taken by the propaganda. In fact, the interviews reveal that they largely thought a lot of the propaganda was nonsense. Okay? They were not easily fooled by some of the propaganda being spewed by the Nazis. Also, you know, for these duties, the Nazis are not taking engineers who are helping build submarines and so on. You know, these members of Police Battalion 101 are working class members of society, mainly chefs and servers and cashiers and factory workers and truck drivers, okay? There's a wide representation, right, of pretty average people within the community. And they're being selected at random, you know, based upon these demographics and job occupations. We're not selecting people here who are particularly psychopathic or sadistic or prone to aggression or anything like that. There's no personality screening, okay? So these are pretty ordinary people, okay, chosen at random. And also they were from Hamburg, okay, in Germany. Now this is also important because, well, the Nazis eventually became quite popular across all of Germany. Hamburg remained the place in which they had the least support. Before the Nazis came to power, Hamburg had overwhelmingly voted for Social Democrats and communists, okay? Hamburg was referred to as Red Hamburg by the Nazis. It wasn't meant as a compliment. It was meant to refer to the fact that there was still support for communism in Hamburg, okay? So why am I telling you this? Because if you wanted a group of men who would be least likely to be the willing executioners for Hitler, it would be this group of men, okay? A group of men who were too old to be raised in the Nazi bubble, too young to have fought in World War I, from Hamburg, where there's pretty little support, relatively speaking, for the Nazis, and a kind of average representation of multiple working class jobs. And despite them being what on paper would seem to be the least likely group to be willing executioners for Hitler, they became the second most deadliest battalion in all of the war. And if you take into light the time in which they were operating, you could argue that they were the deadliest battalion that there was in the Second World War. What were their duties? Like I say, they were operating not too far from Treblinka. Their main responsibility was to clear the Jewish ghettos where Jews were living at this time, transport them to the trains, and then the trains would take them to Treblinka. Treblinka was a death camp, simple as that. There was no living quarters, there was no labor fields, there was no work yards, okay? There was nothing waiting anyone who got off the trains at Treblinka other than the gas chambers, okay? Everyone who got there was killed. And the members of Police Battalion 101 knew this, okay? They knew that they were sending people to their deaths as they escorted them to the train. In total, they cleared about 48,000 Jewish civilians, so men, women, and children from the Jewish villages and ghettos where they were living to the trains to Treblinka, where they were killed. Sometimes if the trains weren't running or if they were too far from the trains, their responsibility would be to execute everyone who lived in that village or town using their rifles, okay, via mass firing squads. And this would be, face-to-face killing. And we know that they killed about 38,000 Jewish civilians, again, men, women, and children, okay, via firing squad. The very first action was the massacre of Josefall. This was only about 2 weeks after they had been conscripted for this role. And they were told to execute everyone who lived in Josefall, all 1,500 civilians, all men, women, and children. And they were to do so using their rifles via firing squads. Now, what we know is that this first event of massacre was quite psychologically traumatizing, okay, for the shooters. They had recurring nightmares for a good period of time following this. They got drunk that night in order to numb the distress that they were feeling. And even decades later, when being interviewed, they remembered this day in very vivid detail, okay? They remembered exactly what the town looked like. They remembered the names of the streets, okay? They remembered very, very clearly the people they had killed, what they had been wearing, what they looked like, okay? They could describe them vividly. But probably what's most disturbing is how quickly the routine of killing became really quite numb, okay? As we go on talking about the next mass execution, they remembered less details, and then less details still with the next one, and less details, okay? Until they could no longer remember even the names of the towns in which they had executed, okay? But of course, they certainly couldn't remember the street names or what the individuals looked like, okay? Now, when Christoper Browning read over these transcripts, he concluded that they could be categorized into one of three groups, okay? So these members of Police Battalion 101, I'll start with the bottom, were either evaders. Now, evaders were those who opted out of the face-to-face killing, okay, who didn't want to kill civilians with their rifle. They still helped in some way. They maybe surrounded the village from the outside to make sure no one escaped. They would help escort individuals to the train. So they're still helping in some way. They're just avoiding the direct face-to-face act of killing. Now, when asked why they wanted to opt out then and years later when being interviewed, the reason they gave was because they were not strong enough like the other men to fulfill this role, okay? That's the argument they gave, that they were not physically or mentally strong enough to act in the killing of civilians. Now, what this allowed them to do was opt out without criticizing their fellow comrades, right? Remember, this is a group of 500 men who are completely separated, right, from society. They're living only with each other for the duration of their duties, okay? In a situation like that, someone doesn't want to be ostracized, right? They don't want to be the enemy of the group, okay? And by making the argument that they did, that, I'm not strong enough to do this, they're actually boosting the ego of their fellow comrades, okay? And so it's avoiding the chances of them being ostracized and excluded, targeted by their fellow men. The second and largest group were the accommodators, those who obeyed orders, okay? But they believed it was a dirty task, a task that was unenjoyable, okay? So they wouldn't volunteer readily for executions, okay? But they would do so if asked to take part. And like I say, this would be the largest group doing what's commanded of them, but not really volunteering for kind of any extra duties. This other group is the eager killers. the group who actually came to enjoy the act of killing, who enjoyed their power and status over others. They would volunteer for the executions. They would volunteer for what was called the Jew hunts, in which they would chase down those in the forest who had managed to escape. They would take tally of their kills and then compete with one another to see who could have the most kills in a particular village. Some would torment, torture, humiliate their victims before killing them. Okay, so they came to really enjoy this role that they had been assigned. So that's who the men were. Okay, I'm going to go on now to give some insight into how we might explain this using psychological concepts and theories. And by the way, in the exam, I won't be asking you about the historical background facts I've given you, right? I'm going to only be asking about the psychological theories and so on. I'm just laying out the case so you understand it, so we can now try and explain it and apply theories to it. So kind of like I tapped into last time, at the end of World War II, the personality perspective was the most popular perspective in psychology. The explanations were focusing on the fact that there was something psychologically abnormal about the Germans, some personality traits, so higher rates of sadism or authoritarianism, or a trait of anti-Semitism because of the German culture. And the idea was that, you know, something could never happen in the US, for example, okay? But the social psychology experiments that were really beginning to take off really countered this perspective, okay? When Stanley Milgram, for example, did his experiment to see if people would shock other people when told to do so, he expected to find that Americans would not, but actually that's not what he found, okay? So social psychology began to argue that actually what was occurring was because of group processes. It was because of situational risk factors or situational characteristics, okay? After all, these men were not, you know, out killing Jews before they were conscripted, okay? They were only doing so once part of a group. And so it might make sense that to understand why they did what they did, we have to look at through this lens, looking at group processes and the influence of group processes. The personality explanations were also coming under fire for a number of other reasons. You know, the authoritarianism perspective was quite popular for a while, that Germans were higher in authoritarianism than other countries were. And we had a scale for measuring authoritarianism. And then at the Nuremberg trials, 11 Nazis completed this survey, and they all scored low in authoritarianism, okay? And so, you know, if the argument was this trait is what's explaining Nazi behavior, the Nazis actually score low in it, then obviously it's not very congruent with the argument being presented. It's called the F scale, by the way, F for fascism. That's what measures authoritarianism. So linking back to what I said last time, this is really tying in with that long-standing debate in psychology, the person versus the situation. Do people do what they do because of some personality characteristics, because it's a part of who they are? Or do they do what they do because some situational characteristics are influencing their behavior? And like I said, we now settle on the fact that there's an interaction between both the situation and the person, okay? Interactionism, that one's behavior really is a result of both. But what we also looked at was that personality traits are more likely to have an influence in more ambiguous situations, okay? Whereas in more extreme, strong situations, that's when the situational characteristics are going to have more of an influence. And what we're talking about here, of course, is a pretty extreme situation, okay, in which you're being told how you're expected to behave, okay? And so there isn't much ambiguity being presented to you. So I talked about a number of experiments that Christoper Browning put forward to help explain this. The first of which is Solomon Ash's conformity peer pressure studies. So in these experiments, a participant is a member of a group, and they're presented with a number of lines, maybe 3 lines in this example, and asked which one is different in length than the others. So you look at this, and obviously it's number 2, but what the participant doesn't know is that everyone else in the group has already been told to give the wrong answer and the same wrong answer, and the participant is going last. Okay, so the participant is there thinking, well, it's obviously number 2, but then someone answers number 1, someone else answers number 1, someone else number 1, someone else number 1, right? Someone else number 1, and then you, the participant, are asked to give your answer, and you can go against the group, okay? Be the only one who says number 2, or you can conform to the group, okay? And give what's pretty evident a wrong answer, okay? Maybe because you don't want to stand out, or maybe because you're actually doubting yourself, or this peer pressure is persuading you to go along with everyone else. Now, overall, 2/3 of the participants, so 66%, conformed to the group at least once in the experiment, and 40% of them conformed every single time. Okay, so every single time give an answer that was quite obviously incorrect, but going along with the group. Now, we can think of a number of explanations as to why one doesn't want to stand out from the group. Okay, there's evolutionary arguments, for example, arguing why it can be, psychologically distressful to be the outsider, okay, to be the one who doesn't belong, because in our evolutionary past, the one who didn't belong, the one who stood out from the group, was the one more likely to be targeted by predators and so on, okay, the one least likely to survive. But what we can all probably agree on is it is uncomfortable, okay, when you're the one who is the one who's different, okay, the one who's standing apart from everyone else. The second experiment is the shock experiments by Stanley Milgram. So in this situation, the participant is being told that there is an experiment being done on how to improve learning. There is a learner who is actually in on the experiment, okay, who's answering a bunch of questions, and if they get a question wrong, they're to be given an electric shock, okay, and the participant is told this is to help us understand how to improve learning, okay. The participant is told to administer themselves the electric shock every time the learner answers incorrectly, and to increase the voltage every single time. And it goes up to 350 volts, which, if it was real, would be enough to kill someone for sure. In actuality, of course, the learner is not being electrocuted, okay? They're just pretending. It's all, make believe, to fool the participant. Now, the researcher is, looking very official, wearing a white lab coat. They're telling the participant, this is really, really important for the research that I'm doing. I'll take full responsibility, okay? If anything goes wrong, if something happens to the person that you're electrocuting, you won't be to blame, okay? The researcher will take full responsibility to see if this, makes it more likely that the participant will go along. And indeed, about 65%, nearly 2/3 of the individuals, the participants, administered the highest possible voltage, okay, the 350 volts, okay, obeying the orders given to them by the researcher. Now, you might argue, well, these experiments were done mainly late 50s, some early 60s. That was at a time when people were more likely to obey authority, less likely to think for themselves. But there's been replications of this study, okay? Berger in 2011 did a replication and found pretty much the exact same results. The voltage was less severe. The highest voltage was 150, okay? But still, about 2/3 of the participants went up to the highest possible voltage, the 150 volts, okay? So even more recently, there's still pretty good evidence that this is still what would occur. Now, Berger in the 2011 study looked at individual differences, okay? Do personality traits have an influence? So those who were higher in empathy, for example, were less likely to administer the electric shocks, okay, than those lower in empathy. Those higher in authoritarianism were more likely to obey the commands and electrocute the participant than those lower in authoritarianism. So there's, of course, room for individual differences, a role for personality traits. Okay, it's not the case that everyone behaves the exact same way in these situations. But what we're finding here is general patterns, a majority who is behaving this way. But I want to quickly acknowledge the developmental perspective, okay? Because there is a pretty good basis to the argument the Germans might have been more likely to obey authority than other individuals from other countries and cultures. Now, authoritarian parenting, which is, very strict, no real communication. You do what I say because I said it, because I'm in control, I'm in command. Okay, that's authoritarian parenting style. This was by far the most common in Germany, but it was the most common in the Western world, largely at that time. But you could argue it was even more extreme in Germany than in other countries. Certainly, physical discipline, abuse, even abuse that resulted in infanticide, was far more common in Germany than in other European countries, 3 to 5 times higher than in any other European country, in fact, substantially higher than France and the UK, which also had pretty authoritarian parenting styles at that time. Also in pre-war Germany, newborns, as soon as they were born, were taken away from their mother and were separated for the first 24 hours after birth. The idea here was that they didn't want too much of a bond being formed between the child and the mother. They wanted to instill independence and resilience from an early age, okay? And mothers were instructed by Nazi doctors not to rush to the needs of their children, okay? Not to, coddle and pamper them, but in fact to make them robust and resilient, okay? So if they cried or encountered trouble, leave them be. One historian explains it like this: German children were whipped, locked into dark rooms, bound to tables. They were forced to kneel before a wall or stand in the corner for hours. They were endlessly frightened by tales of wild figures, black men who would fetch them if they didn't behave, and they were meant to be hardened by the application of constant ice-cold water. So the punishments, the physical punishments, are pretty extreme, pretty severe at this time, and historians focus on the higher suicide rates than in other European countries and argue that a large reason for these higher suicide rates was because children were trying to avoid the punishments that they might face from their parents or the constant physical discipline that they might have from their parents, and that for them, death actually, some cases, seemed a better way out. Another experiment from the social psychology perspective is the prison experiment by Philip Zimbardo. So the basement of Stanford University was transformed into a mock prison, okay? Students could volunteer to participate in the study, and if they did, they were randomly allocated to one of two groups, to be either a guard in this mock prison or to be a prisoner in this mock prison, okay? And then the researchers and Bardo acted as the prison warden, but really he gave the instructions and the guidelines to the guards and left them to it. And they were meant to run the prison on their own without any intervention. In fact, the students assumed these roles all too well, okay? The experiment was meant to run for 2 weeks, but it didn't even last 1 week, okay? Because some of the guards were enjoying their roles far too much, the power that they had over the prisoners, okay, would torment and humiliate them in some extreme cases. Let me play this video actually as an example of what I'm talking about.
On the first day, I said, this is not going to work. I mean, the guards felt awkward giving orders, and they'd say, okay, line up, repeat your numbers, and the prisoners start giggling. Hey, I don't want anybody laughing. 3, 2, 1. And then a very interesting thing happened. Dave Eshelman, who the prisoners named John Wayne, like he's a Wild West cowboy. He begins to be more extreme.
I decided that I would become the worst, most intimidating, cruel prison guard that I could possibly be.
I see in the future that you do work when you're told. Say it again. Say bless you, correction officer.
I was sort of fascinated myself that people were believing the act, and I was trying to see how far I could take it before somebody would say, okay, that's enough, stop.
We did have to do things like push-ups. We would have to sing things. At the beginning, we protested some of the actions. We did things to irritate the guards.
So the guards' authority was challenged right off the bat. And the guards had to decide how they were going to handle that, and they had to decide it without our input. I mean, again, this was not a Milgram study in which we were standing over them telling them what to do. And they began to see the prisoners' behavior as a kind of an affront to their authority, and they began to push back.
We would ramp up the general harassment, just sort of crank it up a bit. Nobody was telling me I shouldn't be doing this. The professor is the authority here. You know, he's the prison warden. He's not stopping me.
This is unbelievable. They took our clothes.
Hands off the door.
There was the first evening a kind of rebellion that took place.
The prisoners rebelled. They barricaded themselves in their cells and said, we refuse to come out. They took off their numbers. They didn't want to be de-individuated. They started cursing the guards to their face. And the key turning point was the guards began to think of them as dangerous prisoners.
In fact, what Zimbardo concluded was that there were three types of guards, okay, that the guards could all be split into one of these three categories. And I hope immediately you see a connection between these categories and the categories discovered by Christoper Browning when looking at Police Battalion 101. So we have a group of good guards, okay, who didn't really enjoy their power over the prisoners, humiliating the prisoners. When they thought they weren't being watched, they would actually be quite nice to the prisoners and not really stick to the role that they'd been assigned, maybe give the prisoner some reward or treat if they could. The largest group is the obedient guards, those who did the roles that they'd been assigned, fulfilled their responsibilities, okay, did what was told of them, but didn't go any step further, okay? They didn't enjoy tormenting the prisoners, for example. And then lastly, a group of tormenting guards, right? Of course, similar to the eager killers, okay, in Christoper Browning's groups, these were the individuals who enjoyed their status, their power over the guards, their dominance, okay, and took to their roles all too well. In the example in the video, taking the clothes of the prisoners, for example, finding unique ways to punish the prisoners if they stepped out of line, okay, enjoyed humiliating and tormenting them when they could. Now, interestingly, these three categories have been discovered by other researchers looking at other atrocities, wartime events, US troops committing some atrocities in Vietnam, terrorist organizations in the Middle East, okay? A number of researchers have looked at certain cases and came to a conclusion that in these sorts of scenarios, there's three groups of men that emerge, okay? The largest group being the obedient ones, okay? Who give in to peer pressure, who are compliant, okay? Who don't want to stand out of line, who don't want to stand out, okay? Who do what's told of them, who do what's expected of them. And then two smaller groups, you know, a group who say, no, this is wrong. So maybe the minority who, you know, refused Stanley Milgram's instructions to electrocute the Confederate. The group of good guards, the group of evaders in the Christoper Browning conclusions. And then a group who enjoy this power trip, okay, who enjoy being able to torment others when there's no fear of consequences for their actions, right? When they have free reign to really be as sadistic as they want to be in these given circumstances. And then the final piece of evidence is evidence to do with cognitive dissonance, okay? So cognitive dissonance is when you are acting in a way that's not in line with your views and perceptions, which therefore causes mental discomfort. And you then have to change your behavior so it's in line with your perceptions, or you have to change your view on what it is so it's in line with your behavior, okay? So, you know, everyone wants to be the hero of their own story, right? No one wants to look at things in which it paints them as the villain, right? People often, you know, rationalize things, excuse things, and so on, come up with some explanations for why they may have done what they did that maybe puts them in a more positive light, right? Or we might even misremember or distort certain events, okay, in a way that's maybe more self-serving. The most frequent example in the literature is smoking, that smokers often will deny evidence over the consequences of smoking for their health, that they'll say, oh, you know, the evidence actually isn't all that clear, or they'll give some argument like, I know so-and-so who lived to be 100 and they smoked every day, okay? They'll give some, you know, argument that tells them that actually smoking isn't all that bad. Because when they're smoking, they don't want to be thinking about the fact that, you know, this is causing harm to them, harm to their health. So instead, they're changing their views, right? So it's in line with their behaviors. So Festinger was really the first to study cognitive dissonance. This quote by him is that people come to believe in love the things they have to suffer for. One of the first experiments he did with Carol Smith was with university students. They were recruited to take part in a really boring, tedious, mind-numbing task. And after they were finished, they were told, get your friend to do this and we'll give you a reward, okay? And so they didn't know what the reward would be. And so a number of them did talk their friends into doing this, you know, pretty boring, mind-numbing activity. And then they were given the reward. Some were given a small reward, about $1. Some were given a large reward, what would be equal to about $100 today, okay? And then after some time had passed, they were asked to fill out a questionnaire on just how boring the task actually was, okay? Now, those who were given the large sum, the $100, okay, they reported it as being just as boring as it was, okay? They didn't distort the memory or anything like that, okay? They remembered it as being pretty boring, and they were honest and transparent with the fact that this was boring, probably because they could easily justify the fact that their friends had taken part in this tedious task, right, for 20, 30 minutes, whatever it was. They got $100 out of it. It's not, you know, it's not really that hard to justify this. But if you were only given $1, okay, then those participants actually reported it as being not that tedious, not that boring. It was actually perfectly fine. So it seems as though they had distorted it, okay? Because for them, it was harder to justify the fact that they had talked to their friend into doing this really tedious activity when they had only been given $1 in exchange, okay? So in order to tell themselves, well, I'm not a bad friend and so on, they had convinced themselves that actually the task wasn't really all that bad. So if we're applying this to the perpetrators of the Holocaust, what we're looking at is a transformation of opinions that's in line with their behaviors, okay? And in fact, a number of men in Police Battalion 101 were not anti-Semitic at the beginning of their conscription, okay? But as the killing went on, they became more and more convinced that what they were doing was righteous, that who they were killing were enemies of Germany, okay? That they were justified in what they were doing. And so their anti-Semitic attitudes were growing as time went on, okay, as a consequence of their actions, trying to justify their actions. Furthermore, the fact that these men were given the choice to sit out probably further increased the need to justify what they were doing, okay? Now, I'm going to show you a series of letters by a soldier in Police Battalion 105 to illustrate this. It's a similar battalion to 101, but operating in Lithuania. But it's just that these letters pretty well illustrate what I'm talking about. So this man has had a pretty cushy, easy job in Norway, okay? And then he's been reassigned to the Northern Front in Lithuania. Once he arrives, he writes home to his wife. We have the date. He says, the major said that every suspect is to be shot immediately. While I'm in suspense, the gentlemen fancy themselves as very important. So he seems to be a bit skeptical over this instruction that's been given to him. 2 weeks later, this is another letter to his wife. The Jews are free game. Anyone can seize one off the streets. How they actually live, I don't know. We give them our bread and more. It cannot be so tough. One can only give the Jews some well-intended advice to bring no more children. They have no future. So what we see here is some sympathy, right, for what the Jews are experiencing right now, and even some act of charity, okay, the fact that he's sharing his bread, okay. So not really strong evidence of anti-Semitism, for example, at this point. 6 weeks after that letter, he writes back, here all the Jews are being shot. Everywhere such actions are underway. Yesterday night, 150 Jews from this place were shot. Men, women, children, all killed. The Jews are being totally exterminated. Say nothing about it to our daughter. Now, there's two main points here. First of all, the detachment in this writing. He's part of the executioners. He's the one killing the civilians. But he doesn't say, I shot Jews. He says, all the Jews are being shot. It's written very passively, so he can detach himself from the actions. Second of all, he's clearly ashamed because he tells his wife to keep it hidden from his daughter. Okay, he doesn't want his daughter knowing what he's doing. So we can see at this point, there isn't really great confidence evident that what he's doing is right. Okay, there's pretty clear shame. But only 9 weeks after this letter, after he's taken part in more and more killing, we see a pretty unbelievable, disturbing transformation. When one sees a prisoner camp, one can see miserable scenes. The people would be better off dead. After suffering casualties, he became angry and says he'd like to shoot down all Russians, calls them beasts, dogs, and trash who need to disappear. When he misses an execution of prisoners, he says it was said to have been fun. And then when he's asked to film with a camera a subsequent execution, he says, in the future, my film will be a document of great interest to our children. So the same individual who only 9 weeks ago was telling his wife, keep this a secret from my daughter, okay, is now with the view that this is going to be something that will actually make his children proud of him, okay, because he's doing something that's righteous. I want to give some corroborating evidence just briefly to what I'm saying. There's a book by Oswald Rifeisen called In the Lion's Den, in which he outlines his time with German soldiers. He was 17 years old. He spoke fluent Polish and German. When he was stopped by the police in Belarus and asked for his identity papers, he said that they had been stolen because he was Jewish and didn't want to reveal himself as Jewish. It wasn't, an unbelievable story. Once they learned that he spoke Polish and German, they told him, there's a German battalion coming into town. We want you to be their translator. And so he went to live and work with this battalion as the translator for them as they operated in Belarus. So obviously keeping secret the fact that he's Jewish and living in a lion's den, as the title of the book illustrates. And then when the battalion was preparing to execute a Jewish ghetto the next day, Oswald Rifeisen snuck out during the night, went to the village, told them, you all have to flee, you're all about to be killed, okay? Sadly, they didn't believe him, okay, and they were all executed the next day. But news of this got back to Sergeant Hein, who was the sergeant of this battalion, that Oswald Rifeisen had betrayed him, okay, that he had foretold the village that they were about to be executed, had warned them in advance. Now, Sergeant Hine had developed a bit of an unusual relationship with Oswald Rifeisen. He saw him as a bit of a son figure. And so he felt quite betrayed, and he asked Oswald, why did you do this? And Oswald replied, because I'm Jewish. And Sergeant Hine said, well, that's a problem. And then he left the window open, and then he left the room, okay, allowing Oswald to escape. So Oswald Rifeisen wrote a book in 1990 on this, but he also gave testimony at a number of legal proceedings. And what we find in the testimony is he also, when describing the battalion, describes them as falling within 3 categories. And it's in his description, the same categories described by Christoper Browning. A group who were eager killers, okay, who couldn't wait to torment others and have this power trip. A larger group who would obey orders and didn't want to step out of line, but did no more than that, no more than their orders. And then a smallest group of those who stepped out or opted out of the act of killing and were, morally against what it was that they were doing. I want to acknowledge possible criticism of what it is I'm saying. There's sometimes a fear that when we're looking at what causes acts of violence, we're somehow condoning or excusing the acts, okay? Now, this is true not just for these explanations, but for all the explanations we're going to look at. But I would say that certainly isn't true, okay? That there is a clear difference between understanding an act and excusing it, okay? Or, studying it and condoning it. What we've looked at here are general patterns, okay, general findings that tell us something about how a group will behave. They don't tell us how one particular individual will behave, because there is that role of individual differences, free will, okay? There were those who refused to electrocute the learner in Milgram's experiments, those who didn't conform with the group in Solomon Asch's experiments. They were the minority, but still the possibility was there, okay, to stand out, to not conform to peer pressure. So, none of these are deterministic. One should still be held responsible. There's still individual responsibility here. Another point I'll make, going back to the person situation debate, was in the person debate, the person perspective rather, I said this anti-Semitic trait was often an argument put forward for why the Germans did what they did. One main counter argument to this is that it wasn't only Jews who were victims to the Nazis, right? 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, but there were 5 million other minorities and prisoners of war, okay? 5 million individuals also killed who the Nazis said had the wrong skin color or came from the wrong country or had the wrong religion, okay? Or had voted for the wrong party, okay? Somehow they didn't fit what the Nazis viewed as being pure. And so this anti-Semitic trait wouldn't explain the killing of these other 5 million individuals. I'm going to give you an example of compliance. This is a pretty old TV show, but it's kind of like a old hidden camera show, if you like, to see how people behave when they don't know they're being watched. Okay, so hopefully you've all had a chance to do those surveys, ask yourself these questions. You probably did see some dissonance. Maybe it was surprising, maybe you were a bit more aware. And you can think of maybe some strategies you maybe use, maybe some rationalization, right? So you shouldn't text and drive, right? But you tell yourself, well, I only do it when I really need to, or everyone does it, or I only do it after I check that it's completely safe. You have some rationalization potentially. That might be one strategy for lessening the discomforts, okay? But there's others too, right? Just being in denial, for example, would also be a strategy. Interestingly, in the Milgram studies, there's also evidence of cognitive dissonance, or at least shifting of opinion, in that the participants were asked what they think of the person that they're electrocuting, And if they chose to go the full max and electrocute this person, they would report the person as being not very nice looking, not very friendly looking. Okay, they had some kind of negative characteristic with the person, as if on some level they were trying to tell themselves, I'm kind of justified in electrocuting this person, that they somehow kind of maybe deserved it, right? And they're kind of lessening this discomfort so that they're not shocking a good person, for example. I've talked you through this example of an atrocity being committed when people were really just being compliant. Okay, I don't have time to do this, but you can think of other examples other than World War II, okay, in which atrocities have also been committed, okay, largely maybe also because of conformity. These slides are up on Canvas, so you can go over them at your leisure. But one of them is an example of a mass suicide within a cult, okay, in which again they felt as though there was pressure to go with the group, okay, this conformity was contributing to the atrocity. Another is the killing of innocent civilians in Vietnam by US troops. Even though they knew that the orders were incorrect, okay, they knew that the individuals they were killing were not soldiers, they were civilians, they still went ahead, okay, with the orders they had been given. Again, because they were conforming, okay, as part of the group. They felt as though this is what's expected of us, this is what we're meant to do. I don't want to be the one who, is the outsider of the group, okay, and tells the group that what you're doing is wrong. And there's further reading on these examples as well, okay. I'm out of time, but if there's any questions, come up and ask. Otherwise, I'll see you next time, okay. Thanks very much, everyone.